In a bustling city where hospitals overflow with patients and time is a luxury few can afford, Dr. Naomi Parker was known for one thing: listening. A dedicated and compassionate physician, she spent years building trust with her patients, those who felt unseen, unheard, and overlooked by a healthcare system that too often failed them. But one interview changed everything. When Naomi spoke out about the uncomfortable truths in medicine, stories of misdiagnoses, silent biases, and the need for equity, her words were twisted. A calm and measured plea became a weapon of controversy, sparking public outrage. Overnight, Naomi went from being a respected doctor to a divisive headline. The hospital placed her on leave, colleagues turned their backs, and a community she had fought for seemed to forget her. Alone and humiliated, Naomi faced a choice: fade into silence or fight back for the truth. As patients began to rally behind her, unexpected allies emerged, and small acts of kindness reignited her purpose. But the battle would not come without its costs. When a life-or-death emergency exposes just how dangerous her absence has been, Naomi finds herself thrust into the spotlight again, this time with everything on the line. Can one voice stand against a system that thrives on silence? Can Naomi reclaim her place and prove that the truth is worth fighting for? Dr. Naomi Parker glanced at her reflection in the mirror of her modest apartment bathroom. The early morning sunlight peeked through the window, casting soft light on her tired but determined face. At 34 years old, Naomi had dedicated her life to medicine, working long shifts at Westbridge Medical Center, a mid-sized hospital serving a diverse but underserved community. Her days were filled with diagnosing illnesses, treating patients, and really listening to those who often felt ignored. Her one-bedroom apartment was simple, decorated with minimal flair: cream-colored walls, a single couch, and a small kitchen where dishes sat in the drying rack from the night before. Naomi's brother Ethan often teased her about the lack of personal touches, saying, "You're like a guest in your own home." To Naomi, though, this apartment was more than enough. It was clean, quiet, and above all, hers. Now, as she secured her white coat and adjusted her braided hair, she felt a small flutter of nerves. It was interview day. The local news had reached out, asking her to discuss disparities in healthcare, a topic she spoke about often in small medical conferences. Today, though, it would be different. It would be on television. "Just breathe, Naomi," she murmured to herself. In the living room, Ethan lounged on the couch, headphones around his neck. At 22, he was finishing his degree in computer science and had recently moved in to save money. Naomi often found comfort in his presence. He had a knack for lightening the mood. "You're going to kill it, sis," he said with a grin, sensing her hesitation. "Tell them the truth like you always do." Naomi smiled softly, grateful for his confidence. "Thanks, Ethan. I'll do my best." By the time Naomi arrived at the news station, the nerves had settled into quiet determination. She had prepared for this moment. She knew the facts, the statistics, and most importantly, the stories of real people. The waiting area was bustling with producers and camera operators, all moving with the hurried energy of live television. A reporter named Lisa Monroe introduced herself. She was young, with sharp features softened by a warm smile. "Dr. Parker, we're so excited to have you here today," Lisa said, shaking Naomi's hand firmly. "I read up on your work, and I think this is such an important discussion." Naomi returned the smile. "Thank you for giving me the platform to share it." Soon, Naomi sat under the bright lights of the studio, her white coat crisp and clean, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The cameras began to roll. "Welcome back," Lisa said into the camera. "Today we're joined by Dr. Naomi Parker, a respected physician at Westbridge Medical Center, to talk about disparities in healthcare. Dr. Parker, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," Naomi replied, her voice steady. The questions began simply enough. What challenges do underserved communities face in receiving quality care? How do implicit biases affect patient treatment? Naomi spoke clearly, giving examples of patients who were dismissed or misdiagnosed. She recalled an elderly woman whose chest pain was brushed off as anxiety until Naomi insisted on more tests, uncovering a blocked artery. She shared the story of a young black boy whose breathing issues were minimized until she ordered a full evaluation and found early signs of asthma. It's not about blaming individuals, Naomi emphasized. It's about recognizing patterns, asking tough questions, and doing better. Patients need to feel heard and respected, no matter who they are. Lisa nodded thoughtfully, guiding Naomi into more complex discussions. Naomi remained calm but passionate, her words careful and deliberate. She knew these conversations were delicate, but they were necessary. As the interview wrapped up, Lisa smiled again. "Thank you, Dr. Parker, for sharing your perspective and for your commitment to your patients." Naomi exhaled, relieved. "It's been a privilege to share." The producer signaled that they were off the air. Lisa leaned in and said softly, "You did an amazing job. More people need to hear this." Naomi smiled, gratitude blooming in her chest. Maybe this would make a difference. Maybe people would listen. By the time Naomi got home, she felt drained but proud. Ethan was already on the couch, a laptop open on his knees. "How did it go?" he asked as she dropped her bag by the door. "It went well," Naomi replied, settling onto the armchair. "The reporter was kind. I think I got my point across." Ethan grinned. "Told you, you're a natural." Naomi allowed herself to relax, finally feeling the weight of the day slip away. She heated up leftovers, Ethan's laughter echoing in the background as he watched a silly video. For a moment, the world felt simple and good. The next morning, Naomi woke to the faint sound of Ethan's voice in the living room. Something about his tone made her pause. "What are you looking at?" Naomi asked, stepping out of her room. Ethan turned the laptop screen toward her, his expression troubled. Naomi's face stared back at her, frozen mid-sentence in a thumbnail. Above it, a glaring headline screamed, "Doctor accuses healthcare system of racism." "What is this?" Naomi whispered, her stomach sinking. Ethan clicked play. The interview she had so carefully given had been cut and spliced into something unrecognizable. The nuanced conversation about equity was gone. In its place were fragmented sound bites that sounded accusatory, even inflammatory. "They twisted everything," Ethan said, anger bubbling in his voice. "They turned it into clickbait." Naomi sank onto the couch, disbelief washing over her. She could already see comments flooding the video. "She's ungrateful. Doctors like her are the problem. Who does she think she is?" Her phone buzzed, messages, emails, notifications piling up. Colleagues she had worked alongside for years sent curt, disappointed messages. Others said nothing at all. "What do I do?" Naomi said softly, almost to herself. "You tell them the truth," Ethan replied firmly. "They can't just do this to you." But Naomi's confidence crumbled. The hospital had always been her second home, a place where she belonged. Now, she felt the ground beneath her slipping. Later that morning, Naomi received an email summoning her to a meeting with the hospital administrator, Dr. Alan Grant. The message was short and formal. "Please come to my office immediately." Naomi's heart pounded as she entered the hospital lobby. The staff who usually greeted her with warmth now avoided her gaze. Conversations quieted as she walked by, as though the walls themselves carried whispers. Inside the administrator's office, Dr. Grant sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Naomi to sit. "Dr. Parker," he began, his voice calm but cold, "I trust you've seen the reaction to your interview." Naomi nodded, forcing herself to sit tall. "I have, but my words were twisted, taken out of context." Dr. Grant raised a hand. "Regardless, the hospital is under scrutiny now. Patients are uneasy. and our reputation is on the line." Naomi's pulse quickened. "But I was speaking for the patients, for people who are overlooked." "Effective immediately," Dr. Grant interrupted. "You are placed on administrative leave. This is for your benefit as well as ours." Naomi's world tilted. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. "You can use this time to reflect," Dr. Grant added, already moving papers on his desk. "We'll revisit this situation soon." The meeting ended before Naomi could respond. She walked through the hallway, numb, as the reality of her suspension sank in. By the time she reached her office, she could barely breathe. Her desk, covered in patient files and handwritten notes, felt like a relic of another life. The walls closed in around her as she sank into her chair. She had spent years building trust, saving lives, fighting for her patients. And in one morning, it was all slipping away. The phone rang. Naomi stared at it for a moment before answering. "Dr. Parker?" an elderly voice said, trembling. "It's Mrs. Thompson. I heard you were gone. Please tell me it isn't true. You're the only doctor who listens to me." Tears pricked Naomi's eyes. "I'm here, Mrs. Thompson," she whispered. "I'm still here." But as she set the phone down, Naomi couldn't help but wonder, if no one will listen to me, how can I keep fighting? Naomi sat motionless in her small office for what felt like hours, the weight of the morning pressing into her chest. Outside the door, muffled conversations carried on, though no one knocked or peeked in as they usually did. It was as if the entire hospital had agreed to pretend she no longer existed. She glanced down at her desk. On the corner sat a framed photo of her parents, a snapshot of them standing outside their modest home, proud smiles lighting up their faces. They had worked tirelessly to help Naomi chase her dreams. Her father, a mechanic, always told her, "When you know your purpose, no one can take it away from you." But as she stared at the suspension notice in her inbox, those words felt far away, like echoes from another life. The knock finally came late in the afternoon, sharp and deliberate. Naomi's heart jumped as she looked up to see a familiar face, Leah Martinez, a nurse she had worked with for years. Leah was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, her graying hair tied back tightly, her expression often unreadable. But today, her eyes were soft. "Dr. Parker," Leah said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. She hesitated for a beat, as though unsure what to say next. "I heard about what happened." Naomi tried to keep her composure, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It's temporary. At least that's what they say." Leah gave her a long look, her brow furrowed. "I watched the interview. That wasn't you, not the version they showed anyway." She shook her head. "They wanted drama, and they used you to get it." A rush of relief filled Naomi's chest. "Someone believes me." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. Leah stepped closer and set something on Naomi's desk, a small Tupperware container with a neatly handwritten note taped to the lid. "Eat something. You're no good to anyone if you waste away in here." Naomi picked up the container and smiled faintly. "Chicken soup?" Leah nodded, her lips curving upward in the faintest smile. "Family recipe. Helps clear the mind. I'll see you soon, Naomi." Before Naomi could say another word, Leah turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. The office felt a little less empty in her absence, though. Naomi clutched the soup in her hands, its warmth seeping through the plastic. That evening, Naomi returned home to find Ethan pacing the living room, his phone in hand. His face was a mix of frustration and worry. "Have you seen this?" he asked, holding up the screen. Naomi glanced at it, her own face staring back at her. The interview clip had gone viral, with thousands of comments swirling beneath it. News outlets picked it apart, repeating the twisted headline, "Doctor accuses healthcare system of racism." "They made me sound angry," Naomi said softly, sinking onto the couch. "I wasn't angry. I just wanted to tell the truth." Ethan sat beside her, his jaw tight. It's not your fault. You didn't say anything wrong, they just didn't want to hear it. He tossed his phone onto the table. I can't believe they're doing this to you. You've spent years helping people. Naomi rested her elbows on her knees, holding her head in her hands. It doesn't matter. The damage is done. For the rest of the evening, Ethan stayed close, occasionally checking on her like a shadow. Naomi found herself curled on the couch with Leah's soup, eating in silence as the weight of the day settled over her. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her, let alone offered her kindness without asking for anything in return. When Naomi finally fell asleep that night, she dreamed of her patients' faces she had known for years, voices calling her name, asking for help. "Where are you, Dr. Parker?" The next morning, Naomi woke up early. It was habit. Even without work, her internal clock refused to let her rest. The apartment was quiet, with Ethan still asleep in his room. Naomi brewed herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank notebook she had pulled out. Her thoughts were a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, helplessness. She thought about her patients, about the way their voices were so often drowned out in a system that wasn't built for them. She heard Leah's voice in her head. They wanted drama, and they used you to get it. And then Ethan's words, "It's not your fault." Naomi closed her eyes and took a slow, steady breath. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could decide what to do next. Sitting here, hiding, wouldn't fix anything. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. Naomi hesitated before glancing at the screen. It was a voicemail notification from an unknown number. She pressed play, and a familiar voice came through. An elderly woman, her tone trembling with worry. "Dr. Parker, this is Mrs. Thompson. I don't know if you're still my doctor. I heard terrible things on the news, but I know you wouldn't say something like that. You've always been kind to me. I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't listened to me last year, they never would have caught my heart problem in time. Please don't let them win, Dr. Parker. We need doctors like you." Naomi's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. Mrs. Thompson had been one of her toughest cases, a woman in her 70s who had been sent home repeatedly with stress-related symptoms. Naomi had ordered further tests against protocol, trusting her instincts. Those tests had revealed a critical blockage in Mrs. Thompson's heart. If Naomi hadn't intervened, she would have died. The memory cut through Naomi's self-doubt like a sharp blade. This was why she had spoken out. This was why she fought for her patients. Please don't let them win. Naomi set down the phone and sat up straighter. Something shifted inside her, a quiet resolve, like a spark in the darkness. If no one else would fight for the truth, she would. Later that day, Naomi sat in front of her laptop with Ethan beside her, a determined look on his face. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "They twisted the footage, so we'll show the truth." "How?" Naomi asked, skeptical. Ethan grinned faintly. "Leave that to me." Over the next few hours, Ethan scoured the internet, searching for leads. Naomi hesitated, watching him work. She wasn't sure if exposing the truth would fix anything, but for the first time in days, she felt like she was doing something, moving forward instead of being crushed under the weight of it all. As the sun began to set, Ethan leaned back in his chair, triumphant. "Found something." Naomi leaned in, frowning at the screen. Ethan had tracked down David Owens, an independent investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering media manipulation. David had once been a big name on a national network before leaving to pursue honest reporting. "Reach out to him," Ethan urged. "If anyone can help, it's this guy." Naomi hesitated, her hand hovering over the keyboard. "What if it makes things worse?" Ethan shook his head. "It's already bad, Naomi, but you can't let them take your voice." Naomi stared at the email draft for a long moment before typing, "Dear Mr. Owens, I believe you should see the unedited version of my interview." As she hit send, Naomi felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the interview aired. "Good," Ethan said softly. "We're just getting started." Naomi leaned back in her chair, exhaustion setting in, but her mind was clearer than it had been in days. Maybe there was still a way to turn this around. Outside the window, the city lights flickered in the growing dusk. Naomi watched them quietly, feeling a new resolve settle in her chest. The road ahead would be long, but she wasn't alone. The morning sun streamed through Naomi's window, but she barely noticed. Sleep had been fleeting, her mind replaying the past few days on an endless loop: the interview, the twisted headlines, the voices of doubt from people she once called colleagues. She sat at the kitchen table with her untouched cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone as messages poured in. Some were cruel, cutting like a blade. "I hope you lose your license. Doctors like you are the problem. You just want attention. Shameful. We trusted you, and now look what you've done." Each word stung, but the ones that hurt most came from her peers, people she had worked beside for years. Naomi set the phone down and rubbed her temples, willing the headache to subside. In the next room, Ethan's fingers clacked against his keyboard, no doubt working on something to help her. She envied his certainty. She had once felt so sure of her purpose, so clear in her calling. Now the walls of that certainty were crumbling. "Why did I think my words would matter?" she thought bitterly. The quiet hum of Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. He was on the phone, speaking in low, firm tones. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, holding his laptop. "Naomi, you're going to want to see this," he said. Naomi turned to him wearily. "What is it?" "David Owens emailed back," Ethan said with a small grin. "He wants to meet. He watched the interview and agrees it was manipulated. He said he's been digging into media tactics like this for years." Naomi's heart fluttered with surprise. "He wrote back that quickly?" Ethan nodded, sitting across from her. "Yeah, he's on your side. He thinks your case could expose something bigger." For a moment, Naomi couldn't respond. She had been so focused on the negativity, on the voices tearing her down, that the idea of anyone believing her, felt almost surreal. "What do we do now?" she asked cautiously. "We meet him," Ethan replied, determination etched on his face. "Let him help tell the real story." Naomi hesitated. The idea of re-entering the public eye, even to defend herself, made her stomach churn. But then she thought of Mrs. Thompson's message, of Leah's quiet kindness, and of every patient who had trusted her over the years. "They deserve the truth," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "Exactly. You're not fighting this alone." The meeting with David Owens was set for the next afternoon. Naomi agreed to meet him in a small, quiet cafe just outside the city. Ethan insisted on driving, though he joked about it being a bodyguard service as they pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the cafe was warm and unassuming. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint clink of cups and saucers. Naomi scanned the room and spotted David immediately, an older man with a silver beard and sharp blue eyes. He sat with a worn leather notebook and a tablet, his expression calm but intent. "Dr. Parker," David said, rising to shake her hand. His grip was firm, his tone steady. "Thank you for meeting me." "Thank you for reaching out," Naomi replied, managing a small smile. They sat at the corner table, Ethan nearby but giving them space. David wasted no time. He opened his notebook, showing printouts of the original interview compared with the edited version that had gone viral. "They cut out key parts of your responses," David explained, his voice low and controlled. "They spliced together sound bites to make it sound like an accusation instead of an appeal. This wasn't accidental, it was intentional." Naomi studied the pages in front of her. Seeing it laid out so clearly sparked a mix of anger and relief. "Why would they do this?" she asked. "Clickbait," David replied simply. "They knew your words would provoke outrage, and outrage gets attention. Your story became a headline instead of a conversation. Naomi exhaled, a bitter taste in her mouth. And now my reputation is on the line. David leaned forward, his blue eyes steady. That's why I'm here. If you let me, I'll help you set the record straight. I'll get the unedited footage aired, and we'll tell your side of the story honestly this time. Naomi met his gaze, searching for any hint of exploitation or ulterior motive. Instead, she found something surprising: sincerity. Why do you care? She asked softly. David's expression softened. Because I've seen good people get crushed by this system. I left the networks for a reason, Dr. Parker. You were trying to help people, and you deserve better than this. For the first time in days, Naomi felt a flicker of hope, small but real. That evening, Naomi and Ethan returned home, feeling cautiously optimistic. Naomi sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, jotting down details David had suggested. Patients who might be willing to speak up, facts to back up her claims. Ethan paced nearby, muttering plans to improve her social media presence, something Naomi had always avoided. People need to see you for who you really are, Ethan explained, his voice animated. Not the version they twisted. Naomi nodded, though her exhaustion was starting to weigh on her. We'll figure it out. As they worked, a soft knock came at the door. Naomi frowned. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. She stood and opened the door cautiously, only to find Helen Carter, her elderly neighbor, standing with a small basket of muffins. "Helen?" Naomi said, surprised. Helen smiled warmly, her sharp eyes full of understanding. "I heard what happened," she said, handing Naomi the basket. "I don't have much to offer, but I thought you could use a little kindness." Naomi took the basket, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Helen. That's very kind." Helen patted her arm gently. "I've seen you come home at all hours, dragging yourself up those stairs. I know how hard you work for people. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Naomi swallowed hard, fighting the tears threatening to spill. "That means more than you know." Helen nodded and turned to leave, her steps slow but steady. Naomi closed the door, holding the basket to her chest. She stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her that not everyone had turned their back on her. "She's right, you know," Ethan said softly from behind her. Naomi turned to face him, a small, wobbly smile on her lips. "Maybe," Ethan grinned. "Definitely." As the days passed, Naomi and David worked together to piece her story back together. David reached out to the news station, pressing for access to the original footage. He contacted Naomi's former patients, gathering testimonies that highlighted her dedication and compassion. Naomi, meanwhile, wrestled with her doubts. Each step forward was accompanied by moments of hesitation, nights when the weight of everything threatened to pull her under. But the quiet acts of kindness, Leah's soup, Helen's muffins, Ethan's unwavering support gave her strength. "They believe in me," she reminded herself. "I can't let them down." One morning, as Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her phone rang. It was David. "They're airing the original interview," he said, excitement in his voice. "Tomorrow, prime time." Naomi's breath caught. "They agreed?" "They had no choice," David replied. "The pressure worked. The truth is coming out, Naomi." As she hung up the phone, Naomi closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of possibility, of clarity. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was shifting. That night, Naomi sat on the couch with Ethan, the basket of muffins from Helen on the table. Outside, the city lights flickered, steady and unyielding. "You think this will change anything?" Ethan asked quietly. Naomi looked at him, her gaze steady. "It has to." And deep down, for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The next evening, Naomi sat frozen on her couch, her gaze fixed on the television screen. The unedited version of her interview was set to air in minutes. Ethan sat beside her, bouncing his knee anxiously while scrolling through his phone, glancing every so often at her, as if to check that she was still breathing. 5 minutes, he announced, though Naomi already knew. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, amplifying the weight of the moment. "People might still not believe me," Naomi said softly, almost to herself. Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle but firm. "Then we'll deal with that. Right now, they're finally going to hear the truth. That's what matters." Naomi nodded faintly, but the knot in her chest refused to loosen. What if this changes nothing? The thought hung in her mind, heavy and relentless. As the program started, Naomi clenched her hands together in her lap. The host, a veteran journalist, introduced the segment with a somber tone. "Tonight, we revisit a story that sparked national controversy, a physician's claims about disparities in healthcare that were taken out of context and misrepresented. Now, for the first time, we show the full, unedited interview." Naomi's heart thudded as the screen cut to her. This time, her words played uninterrupted. The deliberate pauses, the calm explanations, the stories of patients she fought for, it was all there. She watched herself speaking passionately about equity, about trust, about why the system needed to do better. "I'm not here to blame," the Naomi on the screen said. "I'm here to advocate for listening, really listening, when people are vulnerable. Healthcare isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about treating people with respect." As the segment ended, the camera cut back to the host. "We leave it to you, our audience, to decide. But one thing is clear: the full story matters." Naomi exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She turned to Ethan, who was already scanning his phone. "It's starting," he said. "People are reacting." Naomi reached for her own phone hesitantly. Messages began to flood in this time. The tone was different. "This is what she meant. Why didn't they show this before? I judged too quickly. I'm sorry, Dr. Parker. Thank you for speaking up. We need more doctors like you." Naomi's chest tightened as relief and disbelief washed over her. Ethan grinned, nudging her shoulder. "See, I told you people would listen." But Naomi couldn't shake her uncertainty. "What about the hospital? What about the damage that's already done?" Ethan's smile faltered, and he didn't have an answer. The next morning, Naomi woke to find her phone still buzzing. Some messages were kind patients thanking her, strangers apologizing for their initial judgment. Others were not. Though the tide was turning, there were still voices of anger, people who refused to believe she had spoken with good intentions. Naomi scrolled until a familiar name caught her eye, Leah Martinez. The message read, "You did good, Naomi. People are starting to see what we already knew. Come by the hospital when you're ready." The words warmed her, but a pit of hesitation remained. How can I walk back into a place where so many people turned their backs on me? Later that day, David Owens called. "You've shifted the conversation, Dr. Parker," he said, his voice calm but optimistic. "People are paying attention, and other outlets are picking up the story, but there's still work to do." Naomi rubbed her temple, exhaustion creeping back in. "It doesn't feel like enough." David paused before replying, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but your voice started something important. That matters." Naomi leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She appreciated David's encouragement, but she wasn't sure what to do next. That evening, Naomi received a call that would force her out of her indecision. "Dr. Parker?" The voice on the other end was one she recognized immediately. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly patient who had left her a voicemail days earlier. Her voice trembled with fear. I don't feel right, doctor. My chest, it hurts." Naomi sat up straighter, adrenaline coursing through her. "Mrs. Thompson, have you called the hospital?" "I'm scared they'll send me home again," Mrs. Thompson replied weakly. "I trust you, Dr. Parker. Please." Naomi's heart pounded. I'll meet you at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson. Go to the ER. I'll call ahead. Ethan, overhearing the conversation, appeared in the doorway. What happened? Mrs. Thompson needs help, Naomi said, already pulling on her coat. I can't let her down. Ethan hesitated. But you're on leave. Will they even let you? They'll let me, Naomi interrupted firmly. They have to. Naomi's car cut through the quiet evening streets as she raced to the hospital, her mind focused on Mrs. Thompson. The thought of the frail woman waiting alone, afraid, lit a fire in Naomi's chest. When she arrived, Naomi marched through the ER doors, her presence drawing startled looks from staff. The receptionist froze, unsure of how to greet her. I'm here for Mrs. Thompson, Naomi said calmly, though her voice left no room for argument. Leah appeared then, relief flooding her face. Naomi, she said softly, I told them you'd come. She's in room 4. Naomi's feet moved instinctively, her coat swishing as she strode through the hall. As she entered the small treatment room, she found Mrs. Thompson on the bed, her face pale, clutching her chest. Dr. Parker, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. You came? Naomi took her hand gently, offering a reassuring smile. Of course I did. I'm here now. The minutes that followed were tense and focused. Naomi reviewed Mrs. Thompson's vitals, ordered immediate tests, and pushed for an EKG. A younger doctor on duty, Dr. Jake Collins, looked nervous, watching Naomi work. Are you sure about the EKG? He asked hesitantly. Her pressure looked stable. Naomi turned to him, her voice steady but firm. This woman has a history of cardiac issues. Her symptoms are subtle, but we're not going to risk it. Dr. Collins nodded, stepping back. Naomi stayed at Mrs. Thompson's side as the tests were completed. The results confirmed what Naomi suspected, a minor cardiac event, one that could have been missed without intervention. Leah entered the room with the results, her voice soft. You saved her, Naomi. Again. Naomi exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and anger boiling beneath the surface. How many more patients are being overlooked while I sit at home? Mrs. Thompson squeezed Naomi's hand weakly. Thank you, Dr. Parker. You saved my life. Naomi smiled down at her, though her resolve was hardening. Rest now, Mrs. Thompson. You're safe. As Naomi walked back through the ER, Leah fell into step beside her. The board's not going to be able to ignore this, you know, Leah said quietly. People are already talking about what happened tonight. Naomi nodded, her gaze straight ahead. Good, let them talk. Leah stopped her before she reached the exit. You belong here, Naomi. You know that, right? Naomi paused, her throat tightening. Thank you, Leah, for believing in me. Leah squeezed her shoulder briefly before turning back toward the chaos of the ER. Naomi stepped outside, the cool night air washing over her as Ethan pulled up to the curb. How's Mrs. Thompson? He asked. She'll be okay, Naomi replied, sliding into the passenger seat. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. What now? Naomi looked out at the dark streets, her jaw set with determination. I'm going back. I don't care how long it takes, I'm not done fighting. As they drove home, Naomi's mind raced with plans. The battle wasn't over, but tonight had reminded her why she started. Her patients needed her. Their voices mattered, and so did hers. They won't silence me again. The following morning, Naomi woke earlier than usual. For the first time in weeks, there was no lingering fog of doubt clouding her mind. Instead, a quiet resolve hummed in her chest, steady and unrelenting. She thought of Mrs. Thompson resting in her hospital bed, alive because Naomi had refused to stay silent. As sunlight crept through the thin curtains of her small apartment, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of tea. Ethan shuffled in, bleary-eyed, scratching his head. You're up early, he muttered, flopping onto a chair across from her. Naomi glanced at him over the rim of her mug. I couldn't sleep. Too much to think about. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Like what? Naomi set the mug down, her expression firm. I need to go back to work. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. And how are you planning to do that? Last I checked, the board was still hiding behind public perception to justify keeping you out. Naomi sighed, clasping her hands together on the table. I don't know yet, but last night, seeing Mrs. Thompson, knowing she could have been another statistic, it reminded me why I do this, why I can't just walk away. Ethan softened, a small smile tugging at his lips. That's the Naomi I know. She returned the smile faintly, though the weight of the challenge ahead loomed large. David's helping to get the truth out, but that's just the beginning. I need to talk to my patients, to let them know I'm still here for them, even if the hospital won't let me through the door. Ethan's face lit up. Social media. It's time to make your voice louder than theirs. Naomi blinked, wary. You know I hate social media. Ethan smirked. I know, but you also hate letting people down. You need to get your message out there. Tell the truth. Show the world the real Dr. Naomi Parker. She hesitated but nodded. Okay, let's try it. For the rest of the morning, Naomi and Ethan worked together to launch what Ethan called a counter-narrative. He set up a page for Naomi on multiple platforms, uploading photos of her at the hospital and short, heartfelt posts explaining who she was and why she fought for her patients. Naomi struggled at first, staring at the screen, unsure what to say. But Ethan nudged her gently. Speak from your heart, Naomi. That's why people trust you. Her first post was simple but honest. My name is Dr. Naomi Parker. I'm a physician who has spent years listening to patients who felt unheard. I was suspended after an interview where my words were taken out of context, but I won't let that silence me. I believe in equity, in fairness, and in treating every patient with dignity. To those who need someone to listen, I'm still here. Ethan hit post before Naomi could second-guess herself. That's it, he said, sitting back with satisfaction. Now we wait. By afternoon, Naomi's phone began buzzing. Slowly at first, one notification, then two, then dozens. Messages began to pour in. Thank you for speaking up, Dr. Parker. We need more doctors like you. I saw the unedited interview. You didn't deserve what they did to you. You saved my mother's life when no one else listened. Don't stop fighting. Naomi scrolled through the responses, her throat tight. Faces of former patients appeared in the comments, sharing stories about how she had helped them. Stories Naomi barely remembered in detail, but ones that clearly mattered to them. Her chest swelled with a mix of relief and quiet pride. For weeks, she had felt isolated, as though the world had turned its back on her. But now, for the first time, she could see the ripple her work had created, proof that she had made a difference. The following day, Naomi received a call from David Owens. His voice buzzed with quiet excitement. You've started something big, Dr. Parker, he said. Your story is spreading faster than we expected. People are talking about how the media mishandled it. Some networks are even apologizing. Naomi leaned against the kitchen counter, stunned. Apologizing? David chuckled softly. It's rare, but it happens. The pressure's on, and I'm not the only one watching. Some of your patients have reached out to me, asking how they can help you. They want their voices heard. Naomi pressed a hand to her chest, her heartbeat quickening. My patients? Yep, David confirmed. They're your biggest advocates, Naomi. You should hear the way they talk about you. The trust you've built with them, it's powerful. Naomi swallowed hard, emotion building. Thank you, David. This isn't over yet, he said firmly. But you've got people in your corner now. Don't forget that. Over the next week, Naomi's quiet resolve hardened into action. She met with patients who wanted to share their experiences, people like Mrs. Thompson, who credited Naomi for saving her life, and Angela Simmons, a single mother who said Naomi's persistence had caught her son's early-stage asthma before it became life-threatening. Each story Naomi heard added fuel to the fire within her. For every person who doubted her, there were 3 more who stood by her. At the same time, cracks were beginning to show at the hospital. Naomi received whispers from former colleagues, nurses, junior doctors who shared how overwhelmed the ER had been since her suspension. Some told her patients were refusing treatment, demanding to know why Naomi wasn't there. Leah called late one evening, her voice low. "The board is feeling the heat, Naomi. The media's turning on them, and patients are speaking out. They're not sure how much longer they can justify keeping you out." Naomi paced the living room as Leah spoke, her mind racing. "Are they willing to meet with me?" Leah hesitated. "Not yet, but it's coming. Keep doing what you're doing." Naomi hung up and sank onto the couch beside Ethan. "They're starting to feel the pressure," she said, her voice quiet. Ethan grinned, proud. "Because you didn't let them break you." That weekend, Naomi sat at the dining table, reviewing patient stories David had compiled. Ethan had stepped out for groceries, leaving the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of city life outside. A sudden knock startled her. She stood, crossing the room to the door, and opened it to find a familiar face, Dr. Jake Collins, the young doctor from the ER. He looked uncomfortable, clutching his hands together nervously. "Dr. Parker," he said quickly, I hope it's okay that I stopped by." Naomi blinked in surprise but nodded. "Of course. Come in." Jake stepped inside, his face flushed with unease. "I don't know if you remember, but I was there the night you treated Mrs. Thompson." "I remember," Naomi replied gently. He shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the floor. "I wanted to say, I didn't handle that well. I should have trusted you. You saw what I didn't see, and I let my pride get in the way." He looked up then, his expression earnest. "You're a good doctor, Dr. Parker, better than most of us, and the hospital needs you back." Naomi's heart softened. "Thank you, Jake. That means more than you know." He nodded quickly, as if relieved, and turned to leave. "I just thought you should hear it from someone inside." As the door closed behind him, Naomi sat back down, a small smile playing at her lips. The tide was shifting, she could feel it. People who had once turned away were beginning to see the truth. And while the fight wasn't over, Naomi knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. Naomi sat at her small dining table, the afternoon light spilling across the pages of her notebook. The quiet hum of the city filtered in through the window, a strange calm settling over the apartment. She had spent the past hour rereading the stories her patients had shared, each one a small, vivid testament to why her work mattered. It felt like fuel to a fire that had been smothered for weeks. The knock at the door startled her. She glanced up, her heart giving an instinctive flutter. Visitors were rare these days. She quickly stood, brushing her hands on her pants before opening the door to find Leah Martinez standing there, her expression serious but soft. "Leah," Naomi said, surprised but relieved. "Come in." Leah stepped inside, clutching a folder tightly in her hands. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, as Naomi shut the door behind her. "But I needed to talk to you." "Of course," Naomi replied, motioning for her to sit. Leah eased into a chair at the table, setting the folder down. Naomi sat across from her, sensing something weighty in her colleague's demeanor. Leah had always been a steady figure, quiet, dependable, and rarely shaken. But today, there was a flicker of something urgent in her gaze. "The hospital board is holding a meeting tomorrow morning," Leah began, folding her hands together. "They're discussing you, your reinstatement." Naomi's pulse quickened. "What brought this on?" Leah gave a small, grim smile. "Pressure. Your story is everywhere, Naomi. The media's watching, and the community is rallying. Patients are refusing to be treated by other doctors. Some have even started calling in, saying they won't come back unless you do." Naomi blinked, stunned. "They're doing that?" Leah nodded. "You've done something the board didn't expect. You've made people care." Not just about you, but about the issue you stood up for. She tapped the folder on the table. This is a petition. More than 100 patients have signed it, asking for your return. Some staff members, too. Naomi stared at the folder, her throat tightening. 100 voices. 100 people who believed in her, who refused to let her name be dragged through the mud. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Say you're ready to come back, Leah replied gently. Naomi looked up, meeting Leah's steady gaze. Do you think they'll listen? Leah leaned back, crossing her arms. They don't have a choice. The board cares about reputation more than anything, and right now, they're losing it. But there's one thing, Naomi. She hesitated, her tone softening. They might ask you to compromise, to back down on what you said, to apologize. The words hung in the air, like a stone dropping into still water. Naomi's jaw tightened as she let them settle. An apology? Naomi repeated quietly. Leah nodded. It's a possibility. They'll try to make this go away without having to face the bigger issue. I wanted to prepare you. Naomi's hands curled into fists in her lap. The idea of apologizing for telling the truth, for fighting for patients who needed her, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. But at the same time, she thought about the hospital, about the patients still waiting for her to return. Could she swallow her pride if it meant helping them again? Thank you, Leah, Naomi said finally, her voice steady. For everything. You didn't have to stick your neck out for me, but you did. Leah smiled faintly, her expression softening. You're a good doctor, Naomi, and the world needs more people willing to speak up, not fewer. Don't forget that. Naomi watched her leave, the petition folder still sitting on the table like a symbol of hope and responsibility. That evening, Naomi sat on the couch beside Ethan, staring at the petition pages. He flipped through them slowly, his expression unreadable. This is huge, Ethan finally said, glancing up at her. You've got an army behind you. Naomi gave a tired smile. It doesn't feel that way yet. Ethan scoffed lightly. Trust me, it is. These people believe in you, Naomi. Now you just have to decide how far you're willing to take this. She leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. What would you do? Ethan hesitated. Honestly, I wouldn't apologize, not for telling the truth. Naomi opened her eyes, turning to look at him. Even if it meant losing everything. He met her gaze. Even then, because once you give up your voice, they'll always expect you to stay silent. Naomi let the words settle, quiet but powerful. Ethan was right. Apologizing might win her a place back at the hospital, but it wouldn't change anything. The same problems would continue unchecked. Her patients deserved better. The next morning, Naomi arrived at Westbridge Medical Center for the first time in weeks. The familiar building loomed in front of her as she stood at the entrance, clutching Leah's petition folder. Patients moved in and out of the doors. Nurses pushed carts of medical supplies, and doctors walked briskly through the parking lot. It was the world she had once belonged to, a world she was determined to return to. She squared her shoulders and walked through the entrance, ignoring the curious glances and hushed murmurs as she passed. Leah met her near the boardroom doors, offering a small, encouraging smile. They're waiting for you, Leah said softly. Naomi nodded, her grip on the folder tightening. Let's do this. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with tension. The hospital board members sat at the far end of a long table, their faces carefully neutral. Dr. Alan Grant, the chief administrator, sat in the center, his fingers steepled together as Naomi entered. Dr. Parker, he said formally, please take a seat. Naomi moved to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, placing the folder in front of her. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, but she kept her expression calm and measured. Thank you for meeting with me, she said steadily. Dr. Grant glanced at the petition folder. We're aware of the public pressure regarding your suspension. It's clear this situation has escalated beyond what anyone expected. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Dr. Grant continued, his tone clipped and diplomatic. The board is considering reinstating you, provided we can reach an understanding. An understanding? Naomi asked, her voice level. We believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you issued a statement clarifying your position and expressing regret for how your words were perceived. The request hung in the air like a heavy weight. Naomi's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. You want me to apologize for something I didn't do? Dr. Grant's gaze flickered. We're asking for cooperation, Dr. Parker. The hospital's reputation has taken a hit. Naomi sat back, her resolve hardening. With all due respect, the hospital's reputation isn't what matters most. Patients are what matter. I spoke up because I saw people being overlooked, ignored, and mistreated. That hasn't changed. Dr. Grant frowned, clearly unprepared for her refusal. Dr. Parker, Naomi cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. You can't silence the truth. I have 100 patients who signed this petition because they believe in what I stand for. They believe in the care I give them. If this hospital wants to rebuild its reputation, it needs to start by listening, not by asking people like me to stay quiet. The room fell silent. Naomi's words lingered like an echo, bouncing off the walls. Dr. Grant shifted in his seat, glancing at the other board members, who exchanged uncertain looks. Finally, Dr. Grant sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. We'll need time to deliberate. Naomi stood, holding the petition folder tightly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here ready to fight for my patients. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her steps steady, her chin held high. Leah waited just outside the doors, her expression anxious. How did it go? Naomi exhaled slowly, a small, determined smile breaking through. I didn't back down. Leah's face lit up. Good. That's the Dr. Parker we need. As Naomi stepped outside into the crisp morning air, she felt lighter. The board's decision wasn't final, but she had said what needed to be said. She had refused to compromise her principles. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt like herself again, steady, determined, and unshakable. They wanted me to be silent, she thought. But I won't let them win. The hospital lobby was buzzing when Naomi returned the next day. Conversations hummed, phones rang at the front desk, and the steady rhythm of footsteps echoed through the hallways. But as Naomi walked in, a ripple seemed to move through the room. Nurses and staff looked up, some offering small nods, others glancing away uncomfortably. Leah had texted earlier. No official word yet. Stay close. They're feeling the pressure. Naomi's plan was simple. Be present. She refused to let her absence speak for her anymore. If the board wanted to deliberate endlessly, let them. In the meantime, she would remind the hospital exactly who she was and what she stood for. She strode through the familiar halls, her white coat absent, but her confidence steady. For the first time in weeks, she didn't flinch under the weight of their stares. She had spoken her truth. That alone anchored her. At the far end of the hallway, she saw Dr. Jake Collins near the nurses' station, his gaze flickering in her direction. After their brief interaction a few days ago, Naomi had wondered if his support was genuine. Now, as their eyes met, Jake nodded faintly. A small gesture, but it was enough to remind her that change, however slow, had begun. Dr. Parker? Naomi turned at the sound of her name. A man in his 60s, leaning heavily on a cane, stood near the reception desk. His face lit up when he saw her. Mr. Bryant, Naomi said, stepping forward with a smile. It's good to see you. How have you been? Better when you're around, Mr. Bryant replied, his voice raspy but full of affection. These other doctors, they don't know me like you do. They don't listen. Naomi rested a gentle hand on his arm. They'll take care of you. I promise. He shook his head stubbornly. Not like you. Before Naomi could respond, a sudden commotion erupted down the hall. A voice, shrill, panicked, cut through the hum of the hospital. Help! Someone helps him! Naomi's head snapped toward the sound. A young boy, no older than 8, lay limp in his mother's arms near the ER entrance. His face was pale, his small chest rising and falling rapidly as he gasped for air. Please, the mother sobbed. He can't breathe. Instinct took over. Naomi moved before she had time to think, her shoes pounding against the tile floor as she rushed toward them. A nurse appeared at the same time, guiding the panicked mother toward an empty treatment room. Naomi followed closely behind, adrenaline surging through her veins. Inside the room, the mother gently laid the boy on the bed, tears streaming down her face. Please, someone help him. He's had asthma before, but this is worse. Naomi's mind clicked into focus. She turned toward the nurse, who looked hesitant. Call respiratory now, Naomi ordered, her voice firm. We need oxygen and a nebulizer, quickly. The nurse hesitated. Dr. Parker, you're not. I don't care, Naomi interrupted sharply. He doesn't have time to wait. The nurse nodded and hurried out of the room. Naomi turned back to the boy. His eyes fluttered, his breathing shallow and uneven. Naomi knelt beside the bed, taking his small hand in hers. What's his name? She asked the mother gently. Liam, the woman choked out. Liam, Naomi said softly, squeezing his hand. You're going to be okay, I promise. She quickly assessed his condition. His lungs were struggling, the wheezing severe. Naomi recognized the signs. Status asthmaticus. It was a dangerous escalation of asthma, one that could turn fatal if untreated. The nurse returned moments later with the oxygen mask and nebulizer. Naomi worked quickly, slipping the mask over Liam's face and adjusting the flow of oxygen. It's okay, Liam. Just breathe in. Slow, steady breaths. His chest rose and fell rapidly at first, but gradually, Naomi saw the rhythm start to stabilize. His mother stood at the edge of the bed, gripping the railing as she watched with wide, fearful eyes. Is he going to be okay? She whispered. Naomi looked up, offering a reassuring nod. He's responding to the treatment. We caught it in time. A shaky sob escaped the woman's lips as she clutched her hands to her chest. Thank you. Thank you so much. Naomi stayed by Liam's side until his breathing had fully stabilized. As she stood, she felt the familiar wave of relief that came with pulling someone back from the edge. This is why I'm here, she thought. But as Naomi turned to leave, she froze. Dr. Alan Grant stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He had been watching the entire time. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the quiet hiss of oxygen flowing through the mask. Naomi straightened, meeting Dr. Grant's gaze head-on. What are you doing here, Dr. Parker? He asked, his tone cool but laced with something else, uncertainty, perhaps. Naomi's voice was calm, unwavering. I saved a child's life. That's what I'm doing here. Dr. Grant glanced at Liam, who was now sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling evenly. The boy's mother turned to him then, her tear-streaked face fierce with gratitude. She saved him, the woman said, her voice trembling but firm. No one else moved. If she hadn't been here, she trailed off, shaking her head. Dr. Grant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After a long pause, he turned to Naomi. We'll speak soon. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Naomi standing beside the bed, her pulse still racing. Hours later, Naomi sat in her apartment, staring at the glow of her laptop screen. News of Liam's emergency had already started to spread. A patient's mother had shared her story online, praising Naomi for stepping in when no one else acted. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, reading aloud. She saved my son's life today, even though she wasn't supposed to be there. She's the kind of doctor we need, someone who doesn't wait for permission to help." Naomi sighed, rubbing her temples. "The board's going to see this. I don't know how they'll respond." Ethan grinned. "They'll have to reinstate you. What choice do they have? You proved exactly why you belong there." Naomi leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. "I didn't do it for the board, Ethan. I did it for Liam." "And that's why people trust you," Ethan said softly. "Because you don't care about politics, you care about people." Naomi glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She thought of Liam's small hand in hers, of Mrs. Thompson's tearful gratitude, of the petition Leah had brought. It all connected like threads, pulling her forward through the darkness. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, she felt steady, anchored by the truth she refused to let go. The next morning, Naomi received a call from Leah. Her voice held a note of excitement Naomi hadn't heard in weeks. "The board wants to meet with you again," Leah said quickly. Dr. Grant's tone was different this time. "I think Liam's case shook them." Naomi's heart skipped. "When?" "This afternoon," Leah replied. "They want to talk about your reinstatement." Naomi let the words sink in. She glanced out the window, the morning sun cutting through the haze of the city skyline. "It's not over yet," Naomi said softly. "No," Leah agreed. "But you're winning, Naomi. Keep fighting." As Naomi hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks: hope. She turned to Ethan, who watched her expectantly. "The board's meeting with me," she said, unable to hide the flicker of a smile. Ethan's face lit up. "Let's go get your job back." Naomi exhaled slowly, the weight of the fight still heavy, but no longer suffocating. She thought of her patients, of Liam's small smile as he fell asleep, of the people who had refused to let her stand alone. Whatever came next, Naomi was ready. Naomi stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in weeks, she was wearing her white coat. She had pulled it out that morning, smoothing the fabric that had hung untouched in her closet during her suspension. It felt strange, like slipping into a forgotten part of herself. Ethan leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, and a small grin on his face. "You look ready to take on the world." Naomi smiled faintly. "I'm not sure if it's the world, but I'll settle for the hospital board." "They're going to reinstate you," Ethan said confidently. "They just need to hear you say out loud what everyone else already knows, that you belong there." Naomi appreciated his optimism, but she wasn't as certain. The board was a machine that valued image over people. Still, yesterday's events had forced their hand. Liam's emergency had spread through social media and local news like wildfire. People were asking questions. Why wasn't Dr. Parker there in the first place? Now the board couldn't ignore her. Naomi wasn't walking into that meeting as a defeated doctor. She was walking in as someone who had proven, beyond any doubt, why she belonged. The hospital conference room was quieter than Naomi expected. The walls were lined with framed photographs of administrators past and present, the kind of images meant to exude authority. The long mahogany table stretched in front of her, just as it had during her first meeting with the board weeks ago. But this time, Naomi felt different. She sat across from Dr. Alan Grant, who looked far less composed than he had before. The rest of the board members were already seated, some with files in front of them, others tapping pens nervously against their notes. "Dr. Parker," Dr. Grant began, his voice measured, though Naomi noticed a crack in its confidence. "Thank you for coming." Naomi nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "I'll be direct. Recent events have placed this hospital under intense scrutiny. Your involvement in the incident yesterday saving the Brooks boy has brought additional attention. While your actions were understandable under the circumstances, you were still acting outside of protocol." Naomi held his gaze. "If I hadn't been there, Liam Brooks might not be alive today." The room fell silent. Dr. Grant glanced at the other board members, his jaw tightening. "We're not here to diminish what you did, Dr. Parker. We're here to find a path forward. The hospital's reputation has taken a hit, and we need to repair it." Naomi felt a flicker of anger, but she kept her voice calm. What happened to Liam Brooks isn't about the hospital's reputation. It's about the care he received or didn't receive. The problem didn't start when you suspended me. It started long before, when patients stopped being seen as people and started being seen as numbers. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Riley, spoke up then. "Dr. Parker, we don't disagree with your passion, but you have to understand that public perception matters. Your interview created division." "My interview was manipulated," Naomi interrupted, her tone steady. "You've seen the unedited footage. You know I never attacked this hospital or its staff. I called for better care. I called for patients to be heard." Margaret shifted, clearly uncomfortable. Another member, a younger man, spoke next. "There's no denying you have support, Dr. Parker. Patients are rallying behind you, and your absence has caused strain within the hospital. We need to consider that." Naomi took a slow breath, knowing this was her moment. "I never wanted this fight," she said softly, "but you gave me no choice. I've spent years caring for patients who feel invisible, who are ignored because their symptoms don't fit into neat boxes. I spoke up for them. That's why they trust me." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Reinstating me won't fix everything, but it's a step in the right direction. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the results. Yesterday, a child lived because I was there. How many more lives are we willing to risk for the sake of public perception?" The room was silent. Naomi could see the shift in their faces' uncertainty, giving way to something else. Recognition. Finally, Dr. Grant exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "We'll take this under consideration. You'll have our decision soon." Naomi stood, keeping her expression calm. "Thank you for your time." As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of Margaret Riley watching her carefully, a flicker of respect in her gaze. Naomi didn't allow herself to hope just yet, but for the first time, she saw the possibility of change. Leah was waiting in the hallway when Naomi stepped out. "How did it go?" she asked anxiously. "They're still deliberating," Naomi replied, "but I said what I needed to say." Leah smiled faintly. "They'll come around. You've already shown them who you are." Naomi gave her a small nod. "Let's hope so." That evening, Naomi sat with Ethan on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees. The petition Leah had delivered to her was now growing online. Patients, families, and community members had started adding their signatures. A local news station had even run a story on Liam's emergency, interviewing his mother. On screen, the woman's voice trembled as she spoke. "Dr. Parker saved my son. She was the only one who knew what to do. If she hadn't been there..." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "We need doctors like her, people who care." Naomi felt a lump in her throat as she watched. Ethan looked over at her. "They're not ignoring this anymore. You're making them listen." Naomi closed the laptop, a quiet determination in her eyes. "Not just to me. To the patients, to the people who need care and don't get it." Ethan grinned. "You're not stopping, are you?" Naomi shook her head. "Not until things change." The phone call came the next morning. Naomi's heart jumped when she saw Leah's name flashing across the screen. She answered quickly. "Naomi," Leah said, her voice breathless and excited. "They voted. You're being reinstated." Naomi sat down heavily in the chair by her dining table, her hand shaking slightly. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Leah replied. "Dr. Grant will make a formal announcement this afternoon. You're back, Naomi." For a moment, Naomi couldn't speak. Relief, disbelief, and gratitude washed over her all at once. "Thank you, Leah," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Leah laughed softly. "Don't thank me. You earned this." As Naomi hung up the phone, She sat in the quiet of her apartment, letting the news sink in. She was going back. The fight wasn't over, but this victory mattered. It mattered for her patients, and for everyone who believed in the truth she had spoken. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What's going on? You look like you're about to cry." Naomi smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "They're bringing me back." Ethan whooped, grabbing her hands and pulling her up. "I knew it! I knew they couldn't ignore you forever." Naomi let out a breathless laugh, the weight she had carried for weeks finally beginning to lift. "I'm going back, Ethan. And not just as a doctor," he said, his tone suddenly serious, "as someone who made them listen." Naomi nodded, determination rising within her again. "This isn't just about me. It's about every patient who's been ignored and every voice that's been silenced." She looked out the window, the city stretching endlessly before her. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Naomi sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's car, her white coat draped across her lap. Outside the window, the city rolled past, the familiar sights of her neighborhood blending into the hum of traffic. For weeks, she had imagined this moment returning to the place she had devoted her life to. Yet now, as the hospital came into view, her heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, keeping his eyes on the road. Naomi glanced at him and smiled faintly. "I've never been readier." Ethan pulled into the parking lot, easing the car into a space near the entrance. Naomi sat still for a moment, staring at the building that had once felt like a second home. She had walked through those doors every day without hesitation until her suspension. Now the building loomed large, a symbol of both her past struggles and her new purpose. "Hey," Ethan said gently, nudging her shoulder. "You've got this. They wouldn't have reinstated you if they didn't know they needed you." Naomi nodded, exhaling slowly. "I know, but this isn't just about going back to work. I need to show them why I fought so hard to come back." "And you will," Ethan said firmly, "one patient at a time." With that, Naomi gathered her coat, opened the door, and stepped out of the car. The automatic doors slid open as Naomi entered the hospital lobby. The familiar sounds washed over her phone calls, beeping monitors, nurses' footsteps echoing against the tile floor. For the first time in weeks, she felt at home. But the moment didn't come without its challenges. Conversations quieted as Naomi walked past the reception desk. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some staff members greeted her with cautious smiles, while others avoided her gaze altogether. She kept her chin up, moving purposefully toward the nurses' station. Leah was there, waiting with a wide, relieved smile. "You're back," Leah said warmly, stepping around the desk to hug Naomi. "The place hasn't been the same without you." "Thank you, Leah," Naomi said, grateful for the familiar comfort of her friend's presence. Leah stepped back, studying Naomi carefully. "You're going to get a mixed reception today. Some people still don't know what to think. Others, well, they're glad you're here. Just remember who you're really doing this for." Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "The patients." Leah smiled. "Exactly. Now let's get you caught up. You're on rotation in the ER today, and let me warn you, things have been rough without you. The place has been overwhelmed." Naomi slipped on her white coat, the fabric settling over her shoulders like armor. "Then let's get to work." The first few hours in the ER were a blur of motion. Naomi fell back into the rhythm of patient care, as though she had never left checking vitals, diagnosing symptoms, ordering tests. The familiar chaos of the emergency room grounded her, pulling her out of the whirlwind of doubt and controversy that had consumed her for so long. Her first patient, a teenager with a sprained wrist, smiled shyly when Naomi introduced herself. "You're the doctor from the news," he said, his voice a mix of awe and curiosity. Naomi paused, meeting his gaze. I'm Dr. Parker, she said with a reassuring smile. And I'm here to help. For every patient Naomi treated that morning, the tension in her chest eased. She felt herself settle back into the work that had always defined her, not the headlines, not the controversy, but the simple act of helping people when they needed her most. But not everyone welcomed her back. At one point, Naomi passed Dr. Alan Grant in the hallway. He was speaking with another board member but glanced at her as she walked by. His expression was hard to read, but Naomi didn't miss the flicker of discomfort in his gaze. She nodded politely and kept walking, refusing to let his presence shake her focus. Later, she overheard a hushed conversation between two doctors at the nurses' station. "I don't know why they brought her back," one of them muttered. "She's a distraction." "Patients love her," the other replied with a shrug. "That's the only reason." Naomi's chest tightened, but Leah appeared at her side before she could dwell on it. "Don't let them get to you," Leah murmured, handing her a file. "There are plenty of people who are glad you're back, and if you don't believe me, go see room 7. Naomi frowned. "Room 7? "Trust me," Leah said, smiling mysteriously. When Naomi stepped into room 7, she froze. Sitting on the hospital bed, propped up by pillows and wearing a small oxygen mask, was Liam Brooks. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand. But when she saw Naomi, her face broke into a bright, tearful smile. "Dr. Parker," the woman said, standing quickly. "You're back." Naomi smiled, moving toward them. "How's our little fighter doing today?" Liam grinned faintly under his mask, his cheeks flushed with color. "I feel better," he whispered. "He's doing great," his mother said, her voice filled with emotion. "They said he'll be able to go home soon. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Parker. You saved his life." Naomi knelt beside the bed, taking Liam's hand gently. "You're a strong boy, Liam. You gave us all a scare, but I knew you'd pull through." Liam's mother placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. "I don't know how they could have kept you away from here. You're the only doctor who really listens." Naomi's throat tightened, but she managed to smile. "I'm here now. That's what matters." As she left the room, Naomi paused in the hallway, leaning against the wall for a moment to collect herself. Liam's small, pale face lingered in her mind, a reminder of why she had fought so hard to return. Leah appeared at her side, handing her a fresh chart. "Room 4's waiting for you. You okay?" Naomi straightened, nodding. "Better than okay." At the end of her shift, Naomi sat in the staff lounge, sipping from a bottle of water as exhaustion set in. Her feet ached, her shoulders were stiff, but for the first time in weeks, it was the kind of tired she welcomed. Leah sank onto the couch beside her, stretching her legs out with a sigh. "Long day?" "The best kind," Naomi replied with a small smile. Leah studied her for a moment, a soft warmth in her gaze. "You know, Naomi, you changed something here today." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "People see you differently now. The ones who doubted you are starting to come around. They're seeing what your patients always saw, that you're the kind of doctor this place needs." Naomi looked down at her water bottle, a faint smile playing at her lips. "It's not about me, Leah, it's about the patients." Leah chuckled. "I know, but you're the reason they're finally being heard." Naomi leaned back against the couch, letting Leah's words settle over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had reclaimed her place, not just in the hospital, but in the fight she had started. The battle wasn't over. There would still be challenges, still people who refused to see the truth. But Naomi knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wouldn't stop fighting. Not now, not ever. That night, as Naomi sat in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Thank you, Dr. Parker. I saw the news about Liam. You're giving people hope. Don't stop." Naomi stared at the message for a long moment, her heart full. Then she set the phone down, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes. Hope. That was all she had wanted to give. And now, she realized, it was spreading one patient, one voice, one small victory at a time. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Naomi's apartment, casting warm streaks of light across the kitchen table. Naomi sat quietly, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, staring at the petition Leah had given her weeks earlier. The pages were now frayed at the edges, a symbol of everything she had fought for. Ethan walked in, his hair messy from sleep, and poured himself a cup of coffee. "You're up early again," he said, giving her a curious look. Naomi smiled faintly. "It's habit at this point." She paused, her gaze still fixed on the petition. "But today feels different." Ethan sat down across from her. "Because you're back at the hospital?" Naomi shook her head. "No, because I know where I'm going now." Ethan raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to explain. She set the mug down and looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Everything that's happened, getting suspended, the fight to come back, seeing patients like Liam, has made me realize something. Going back to work wasn't the end of this fight. It was just the beginning." Ethan studied her for a moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Naomi exhaled slowly. "Not a plan, a purpose." That day at the hospital, Naomi walked through the halls with a new sense of clarity. For the first time since her suspension, her colleagues weren't whispering behind her back. Some still looked unsure, but many nodded as she passed, offering hesitant smiles. It wasn't much, but it was progress. At the nurse's station, Leah was flipping through charts when Naomi approached. "Leah," she said softly, "I need to talk to you." Leah looked up, smiling warmly. "You're back in charge already?" Naomi chuckled. "Not quite, but I've been thinking about what comes next." Leah set the chart down, leaning on the counter. "What do you mean?" "I want to start something outside the hospital," Naomi said, her voice steady. "A foundation. Something that focuses on equity in healthcare, training doctors to listen better, addressing bias in treatment, creating outreach programs for underserved communities. Patients deserve better, Leah. And I don't want to wait for the system to fix itself." Leah's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and admiration flashing across her face. "That's big, Naomi. Huge." Naomi nodded, feeling her heart quicken as she said the words out loud. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I know one thing. I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. People shouldn't have to fight so hard just to be heard." Leah smiled, pride shining in her expression. "You're not just changing this hospital, Naomi. You're trying to change the world." "I'm trying to do my part," Naomi replied softly. Word of Naomi's idea spread quietly among the hospital staff over the next few days. Some dismissed it as idealistic, but others, nurses, residents, even a few senior doctors approached her in private, asking how they could help. One evening, as Naomi packed up her things to leave, Dr. Jake Collins appeared at her door. He looked nervous, shifting on his feet as he knocked softly. "Jake," Naomi said, surprised. "What's going on?" Jake cleared his throat. "I heard about what you're trying to do. The foundation." Naomi nodded, waiting. I wanted to say I think it's a good idea," Jake said quickly, his voice stumbling over itself. "I've been thinking a lot about that night with Mrs. Thompson, about how I hesitated when you didn't, and I realized there's a lot I don't know about what it means to really listen to patients." Naomi softened, motioning for him to sit. "It takes time to learn, Jake. We all miss things sometimes." He shook his head, looking frustrated with himself. "But I don't want to keep missing things. I want to be better. If there's anything I can do to help you with the foundation, anything at all, I'd like to be part of it." Naomi smiled, feeling a quiet sense of pride. "I'd be glad to have you on board, Jake." Over the following weeks, Naomi worked tirelessly to lay the groundwork for her vision. She spent evenings drafting proposals, reaching out to local organizations, and holding quiet meetings with people who shared her passion for equitable healthcare. The community began to take notice. Former patients of Naomi's, people whose stories had once been dismissed, stepped forward to share their experiences. They spoke at town halls, in articles, and on local news, giving voice to the very issues Naomi had fought to highlight. David Owens, the journalist who had first helped Naomi share her story, contacted her one evening. "Naomi," he said over the phone, his voice full of pride, "your fight started something. People are talking. Other doctors are speaking up now too. You're not alone anymore." Naomi stood by the window of her apartment, looking out over the city. The weight of the fight she had carried for so long felt lighter now, as though others had stepped in to share the load. The foundation's first event took place in a small community center on the edge of the city. Naomi stood at the front of the room, a microphone in her hand, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd. There were doctors, nurses, medical students, and members of the community, people who had come because they believed in what she stood for. Naomi took a breath and began. "Healthcare isn't just about medicine," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's about trust. It's about seeing people as more than just patients, as mothers, fathers, children, and human beings who deserve to be heard." She paused, scanning the crowd. "I stood up and spoke the truth about what I saw in my work, and it cost me. But in losing my place, I found something bigger, people who believe, as I do, that we can do better, that we must do better." She smiled softly. "This foundation isn't about one person. It's about all of us coming together to build a healthcare system where everyone is seen, everyone is heard, and everyone matters." The room erupted in applause. Naomi felt her throat tighten, but she kept her head high, her heart full. For the first time, she could see the road ahead clearly, not just for herself, but for the patients she had fought for and for the colleagues she had inspired. That evening, as Naomi walked out of the community center, Ethan waited for her by the car, grinning proudly. "I told you you'd change things," he said as she approached. Naomi smiled, exhaustion and pride mingling in her expression. "It's just the beginning." Ethan opened the car door for her. "Maybe, but it's a pretty good start." Naomi paused, looking back at the community center. People lingered inside, talking, sharing ideas, and planning for the future. A future she had helped ignite. She turned back to Ethan and climbed into the car. As they drove through the city, Naomi looked out at the lights glowing against the night sky. Her fight had begun in silence, in the unseen moments when patients' voices were ignored. But now, that silence had been shattered, replaced by something stronger: hope, progress, and purpose. Naomi knew there would still be challenges ahead. There would still be people who resisted change, who refused to see the truth. But she also knew that she was not alone. The voices she had fought for were finally being heard, and together they were building something better. And for Naomi Parker, that was enough to keep going. Months later, Naomi stood outside the doors of the Equity Health Initiative, the foundation she had dreamed of bringing to life. The modest building was alive with activity, patients coming in for consultations, medical students attending workshops on bias and listening, and doctors volunteering their time to make healthcare more equitable. Naomi stood quietly for a moment, watching it all unfold. The voices that had once been ignored were now at the center of everything. Change didn't happen overnight. She knew that. But every small step brought them closer. Leah walked up beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Look at this," she said, smiling as she handed Naomi a cup. "You've built something real, Naomi, something lasting." Naomi accepted the coffee, looking at her friend with quiet gratitude. "Not just me," she said. "All of us, everyone who spoke up, everyone who listened. That's how change happens." From across the street, Naomi noticed a familiar figure, Mrs. Thompson, leaning on her cane as she chatted with a nurse outside. She spotted Naomi and waved warmly. Naomi waved back, her heart swelling. "This is just the beginning," Naomi said softly, mostly to herself. As the sun began to set, bathing the city in warm gold light, Naomi turned back to the building one last time. The work would never be done, but she was ready for it. She had found her purpose, and she wasn't going to stop. Thank you for being part of Naomi's journey. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that move, challenge, and uplift. Your support helps us share these powerful stories of perseverance, kindness, and hope. Let's keep the conversation going and make sure every voice is heard. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next story.